Hi, I'm Steve Ripley, Vice President of Strategic Accounts at Management Concepts. I'm joined today by two colleagues from our Learning Technology and Solutions team, Dr. Hannah Toney, Director of Learning Development, and Tom Lodenberg, Executive Director of Learning Technologies. So Tom, 2020 pandemic, we see a shift almost overnight from traditional learning to virtual only. I'd like to explore your experiences and Hannah's experiences on the long-term impacts of that shift.
Thanks, Steve. The pandemic certainly has disrupted almost every single industry out there, and the training industry was no exception. One big example of the pandemic affecting the training industry is just a complete and total elimination of all physical instructor-led training classes, which is something that we would never have predicted just months prior. This has forced a lot of training organizations to rapidly pivot to new training modalities, the two biggest beneficiaries being virtual instructor-led training and asynchronous web-based training. We luckily have had a big advantage. We've been running classes virtually for almost 10 years, and we've been developing custom web-based training for even longer. So I'm going to talk really briefly about that evolution for us, and I'm going to give you the real numbers in terms of virtual instructor-led training classes that we ran pre-COVID versus today. But before I do, just one caveat, we've learned a lot over the past 10 years of running virtual instructor-led training classes as a core offering to what we do. Honestly, we've probably made almost every mistake that you can make in the book, but we've taken the steps to correct that. So I promised numbers, let me give you the real numbers. Pre-pandemic, we would regularly run between 20 to 25 virtual instructor-led training classes every week. That's a lot of training. These classes could be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 days in length. So we had the infrastructure in place to be able to run and offer that for years. What we've had to do now with the pandemic is basically hit the turbo button and ramp that up even more. So that good news is we didn't have to do any real pivoting. We just had to ramp up this core offering. So fast forward now, we regularly run over 150 virtual classes per week. And so we literally are delivering tens of thousands of student hours every week in a virtual instructor-led training modality. So we found that there's really 3 key success criteria in being able to do this at scale as we're doing it. The first one is the technology. It just has to be bulletproof. The platform, the software, the no requirement to do any kind of downloads or plugins, that's just not going to work nowadays. We have to be able to address almost any kind of network now that people are taking it not just from their offices, but from their homes. They're taking it while they're traveling. They're taking it when they're on vacation, from their beach house or anywhere. So being able to address all of that from a technology perspective, VPN requirements. So all of these, you just have to have the technology in place to overcome these potential obstacles. The second is support. So we have found that support is key for anyone that's having any kind of technical issues during a virtual instructor-led training class. So we've created a position that we call producers, but in essence, they are the live technical support. So if you're a student in one of our classes and you're having any kind of issue, you're having some audio issues, I can't find the materials that I'm supposed to be able to have access to, producer will swoop in, private chat with you, even pick up the phone and call you if that's your preference, help you resolve whatever technical issue that you're having and get you right back on track so you can actively participate in the class. We've also found that the class doesn't have to come to a screeching halt just because one student is having a technical issue and the instructor now has to play the role of technical support, stop everything and address that one issue. So in addition to the instructor, for every one of our virtual classes, you get that live technical producer support. Speaking of instructors, that's the last super key element here. Our experience has shown us that you can have the world's greatest instructor, someone who has complete dominance over his or her domain of subject matter experience. And you know the kind of instructor I'm talking about, just a real presence in the classroom, great at his or her job. But you move that person over to a virtual environment with no training or preparation, more often than not, they fail. Virtual instruction really is a different animal. So being, the training company that we are, we developed a training plan, training strategy. We set up a sandbox environment where they can in a non-threatening manner, get used to and get comfortable with the technology. And then we have them perform a series of teachbacks to us virtually before we, in essence, certify them that they're ready to go to train in a virtual environment. And we found that to be really key and one of the 3 key success criteria to be able to offer successfully and run virtual instructor-led training at the scale that we're doing.
Well, with tens of thousands of hours of training delivered on a weekly basis, you have to have seen just about everything and developed a methodology to deal with just about everything. So, Hannah, let's talk about long-term impacts and things you've noticed from the development side, the training development side.
I mean, really, so much of it agrees exactly with what Tom said. Virtual is the new norm now. That also means that participants have expanded expectations around how the virtual room is going to function. Pretty much everyone uses a virtual meeting platform, even folks who would never have considered it before. Now, that means that there's expanded technological awareness, but it also means that people come to virtual classes with preconceived notions about how that class will or should work. And they start making comparisons to what they've become comfortable with immediately upon entering the room. That keeps us on our toes in that we need to make the experience as recognizable as possible and as streamlined as possible, while also selecting tools and methods that are going to scale in the way that our business requires. And you just heard those numbers from Tom. So it does have to be able to scale up. It's also worth noting that we're seeing more and more blended deliveries that combine the asynchronous and self-paced options with synchronous learning. So in those cases, you're talking about experiences that often stretch the learning out over time so that you are learning for more time than you would in a traditional classroom experience. That makes the most of the participants' time and focus and energy. And we know from a learning development perspective and a learning experience perspective that when it's designed well, this kind of learning supported over time with discussion, self-paced elements, reflection, and capstone assignments, that true blended method of learning is a really powerful way to increase engagement, retention, and the application of the learned content.
Well, thanks. I'm struck by something that's really fascinating, which is, we start pandemic with, hey, we're all in it together. We're going to keep our expectations reasonable because this is new for everybody, right? But then we quickly transition. And I love the way you put the, increased expectations. Well, now I expect it to be better, and building on Tom's comment, the technology needs to be rock solid. So let me ask you a follow-up on that then. How do we meet learners where they are? How do we use these new methods and new technology to improve the experience, to meet them where they are?
That is excellent question. Thank you so much. In many respects, it really is in the ways I discussed a moment ago. We're offering more blended experiences with multiple modalities over time, a balance of live, virtual, synchronous instruction with asynchronous and self-paced offerings that engage at different points in time and encourage consistent focus and also encourage that reflection and application. Also really focusing on the quality of the virtual environment, not just from a content perspective, but also in the visual and auditory appeal. I mean, it even goes to the point that the programs I work with have increased pre-virtual class communications. And that's to help ensure participants have the proper audio equipment to make the most of the virtual space. So increasing that communication with the students is a really big deal. As Tom mentioned, we of course have technical experts or the producers that are in the virtual room with the facilitators. And the facilitators are very well trained in both virtual delivery as well as in the platform so that they can lead the classes with the same fluidity they expect in the live classroom environment. We've also really increased the focus on visuals and the use of meaningful graphics, while also providing training to our development teams around how to write alternative text. And that's for those graphics so that we're providing an accessible experience so that everyone can get the same meaning and content. And, that's been a focus of ours for years, but it's really come to the front with the move to virtual. What is necessary for an accessible experience? How do we ensure that all of our participants can engage in the learning environment? That's a critical part of the way we develop and deploy our learning materials. We've also expanded the materials we do offer. I think we were pretty focused on the live classroom and live virtual before this. And now we're thinking about ways outside of that environment, like I said, to extend the learning. So we offer more webinars, microlearning, and podcasts than ever before. Each of those methods has the added benefit of breaking the content into smaller and more focused chunks. And these are often more easily accessed also through mobile devices. And that's a really big deal. Part of that meeting the students where they live, they're in motion a lot of times, and the mobile device is an important component. Webinars are, of course, initially usually live and allow some level of Q&A, question and answer, and engagement with the participants, but the recordings then make great, easily accessible refreshers. Microlearning is very, very short and topical, often video-based learning, and that also allows the learner to engage in the moment of need and return as required. And finally, of course, one of the other modalities I mentioned are the podcasts. Those are also typically relatively short, very focused on a topic, and usually fairly conversational audio recordings. They're often accompanied by transcripts, sometimes even handouts or other learning materials. And they can also, again, be accessed just about anywhere on any device, and often also even downloaded for offline listening. We used most of these methods before, but over the past year or so, we've really focused on these more, and I think to the benefit of the learner.
Well, I would also say that it sounds like you've connected them, right? So each layer of learning, right, it supports another layer of learning, and where we might have had a standalone piece, a webinar or a podcast, now those are all part of a web of learning that's supporting. Yeah. So Tom, let me ask you the same question, meeting learners where they are, and insights and experiences that have come from this COVID experience.
Thanks, Steve. Hannah, I liked everything that you were talking about, especially the podcast at the end. It's like I feel like I can't even drive my car nowadays without turning on a podcast. What I like most is that everything that you mentioned, none of that feels like a fad to me. In fact, the market for every single training modality that you talked about, and e-learning, microlearning, podcasts, they've grown every year for over a decade now. The younger generation in the workforce now expects and demands these training modalities. They've grown up with it. I don't see that trend reversing anytime soon. I think of my own two teenagers and the year and a half that they're going to spend in 100% remote learning. This will be an expected modality of training when they're old enough to join the workforce. So fast forward to now, or paying attention now to the workforce that we have in hand. Where does this content come from? We're seeing that both commercial companies and federal agencies are dusting off their sometimes truly excellent instructor-led training content to repurpose them into these modalities. And that's the verb that we've been using, repurposing. So think about the training that you have within your organization that's not being put to use because it's only in the modality of instructor-led training. It might just be sitting on a shelf, literally getting dusty. So we've been lucky enough to have several projects that are underway right now where we're helping government agencies repurpose that existing instructor-led training into engaging, interactive, web-based training.
So if we recap a little bit, we talked first about kind of the increased expectations that require new methodologies and bulletproof technology. And then we talk about sort of this layered learning, this web of learning that to meet those increased expectations and then make sure that we're improving that learner experience. Let's just take a moment and talk about aha moments, right? So what did we learn through this whole process, this whole experience that was truly kind of an aha moment?
Steve, lots of lessons learned over this really trying time of a pandemic from a training industry perspective, and lots of aha moments. But the one that kind of jumps out to me the most
painful
is
moments, right?
Oftentimes painful moments, but every what is it? What's the phrase? A gray
cloud has
dark
a
cloud
silver
has a silver lining. So one silver lining that we've learned is with regards to adult learners who identify as introverts. This has really been their time to shine. Studies show that 40% of us identify as introverts. And during this pandemic, introverts are reporting that they have more time alone, more peace, less of the personal and professional pressures that they find so draining of their energy. And when regards to training for introverts, we're finding that introverts who have been less participatory in a physical classroom environment tend to be much more active in a virtual environment. That means that they ask those questions that otherwise may have gone unasked, and they more actively participate, oftentimes in leadership roles during virtual group exercises. It's a real lesson learned for those of us in the training industry, and we can't forget about this important population when we begin to migrate back to the physical classroom environment.
Okay, Hannah, how about you? Same question.
Well, I mean, for starters, I think related to what I talked about before, that we're really good at pushing our own limits and our own boundaries and exploring new ways. And I love that you called it creating the web of learning, of connecting multiple learning experiences to really build superior learning experiences for our student population. So on the one hand, I think that, but Tom and I chatted before this, and I totally agree with him. I think those of us who are introverted have found this liberating. And the folks who maybe didn't speak up in even meetings in the workplace are finally having their voices really heard too. In so many senses, I do think one of the very best things about this otherwise pretty unfortunate situation is that it's helped to diversify the voices that are able to impact decisions in a really, really positive way.
I loved your point about diversity of voices. Among those voices, we're seeing an uptick in learners with disabilities. So we've talked about accessibility a little bit throughout this conversation. This has also been an aha moment for us as well. So as many of you know, under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, technology used by federal agencies must, by law, be accessible for people with disabilities. So this applies to every modality that we've discussed today. And one stat to throw at you, a recent Bureau of Labor Statistics survey found that almost 15% of federal employees identified as persons with a documented disability. It's a huge number. And keep in mind that disabilities can be permanent, temporary, or situational. So this number is always fluid. And over the years, there has been hesitancy for this population to sign up or to receive training remotely. But those numbers are changing. One last statistic to throw at you to back up the uptick that we've been seeing. With regards to our own virtual instructor-led training classes, in last year in 2020, we delivered over 300 hours of live caption to learners that were hearing impaired. And that was a substantial increase over previous years. Already just through the first third of 2021, we've already surpassed those numbers, those record-breaking numbers from 2020. Again, this is quite the aha moment for us in a trend that we don't see reversing anytime soon.
Great. Well, Hannah, Tom, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences. To our partners in the federal government and in the training industry, please, let's continue the collaboration. We'd love to hear about your experiences and your aha moments. Thank you for joining us. Let's continue the conversation.